Well, before when we talked about the body's levels of organization, one of the things we mentioned was tissues. And what we want to do is we want to take these next couple labs and talk about different types of tissues, as well as showing you representative examples of such. So if you were to look at them under a real microscope, let's pretend right now we're looking under a microscope. You can look at your screen and go like that, and you think you're like looking at it. But anyway, but if you were to look at it under a real microscope, what you'd actually be able to see. So what we want to start is we want to start out with what's called epithelial tissue. But before we go with that, what is a tissue? First of all, we talked about this before. We know it's a group of cells that have similar origin that function together to carry out a particular activity, okay? That's basically what a tissue is. In other words, they can actually take a stem cell, stick a stem cell on a plate, and if they give it the right stimulus, they can grow a whole plate of those types of tissue, that same type of tissue, that same type of cell that will cover that whole plate. Anyway, but that's a tissue. A couple of words that probably are worthwhile knowing. Histology. Histology is basically just the study of tissues. Logi means the study of something. Histo means tissue. Pathologist is one who studies tissue diseases or abnormalities. Okay, so pathologist. And a biopsy. A biopsy, bio means life, and opsy means to view. So basically, biopsy means removal of a piece of tissue, and they can look at it under the microscope to see what's there. Okay, and see if it's okay, if it's not okay, or whatever the case may be. Okay, maybe somebody you've known has a biopsy for one reason or another. Okay, but that's some very common words that we have in regards to tissues. Okay, well, what type of tissues do we have? We mentioned this very briefly when we talked about the level of body organization. We have epithelial tissues. And epithelial tissues basically are tissues that are coverings or linings. They cover something or line the inside of something. Various body tissues that line, like inside the abdominal cavity. We talked about in regards to some membranes like the peritoneum inside the lung or inside the chest with the pleura and stuff like that, as well as the skin. The skin's an epithelial tissue, as well as any tissue that lines the inside of an organ that's open and stuff like that. Inside of ducts are lined with epithelial tissues. So epithelial just means a covering or lining. Epi means upon, okay? So epithelial tissues are coverings or linings. Connective tissues. Let me figure what a connective tissue might do. Oh, it connects, of course, okay? Basically, we're talking about tendon, ligament, cartilage. These things are very common types of connective tissues. Bones are connective tissue. The one that might be a little bit out in left field that we might understand is actually blood. Blood's a connective tissue as well, and I'll talk a little bit about blood and various characteristics of blood in an upcoming video. Third type of tissue is muscle tissue, and the thing that's characteristic about a muscle tissue is the way it's made. It's able to contract, it's able to decrease, or it's able to shrink in size, or reduce the length of a particular fiber. And by doing that, that's what we see in a muscle contraction. That's when muscles get shorter, and that's what a muscle tissue is. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a third lab tissue evaluation video. And then the fourth will be nervous tissue, which guess what? Will come in the fourth type of addition. And nervous tissue is tissue that's able to conduct a certain type of an impulse, and often long distances, like from the brain. Once we get a signal that leaves the brain, it basically only has a couple small connections. So these nerves could be multiple feet long, okay? Obviously very thin, but multiple feet long. We'll talk about that when we get to our fourth video PowerPoint, okay, in regards to tissues. So let's just go back and start here with this one and just spend the rest of the time on this video on epithelial tissues. Again, as I mentioned, epithelial tissues are coverings or linings of something. They also are involved with all the glandular tissues, because glandular tissues have a duct, and that duct is lined with epithelial tissues as well. A couple things that are very characteristic about epithelial tissues is the cells have a tendency to be tightly packed. They're really close together. There's not much gap between them, which is going to be different from what we're seeing in some types of connective tissue where there might be large gaps between cells. There's very little intercellular space or materials. So therefore, if they're packed tightly, there's not much between them. Intercellular means the area between cells, okay? So with epithelial tissues, because they're tightly packed, there's very little, if any, intracellular space. One cell is usually almost right on top of the other, okay? There are many what are called cell junctions. These cell junctions are just one cell touches another, and they could be anywhere from a single layer thick okay, which the word for that will be simple, to multiple layers thick, which will be called stratified, or multiple different layers, okay? They usually have an apical surface and a basement membrane, okay? Which means that what happens is they're attached, they're usually anchored to something at the lowest level as to an area called the basement membrane, okay? And the apical surface would be the part that's more exposed towards the outside. A couple other things that I think are characteristic about epithelial tissues is they're relatively avascular, okay? Vascular would mean to have a good blood supply. Avascular means they don't have a very good blood supply, okay? What they really rely upon is diffusion to be able to get through the small spaces between cells to be able to supply the other cells. When we look at the skin, and that'll be coming in another lecture down the road, skin is put into layers, and as we get closer to the surface of the skin, the outermost layer, the skin starts to die because it's getting further and further and further and further and further and further away of a nutrient source. So as a result, it just eventually the cells will become thinner, they actually die, and then we slough them off, okay? There is a nerve supply that does go to epithelial tissues, so they do have sensitivity. They, pressure, stretch, pain, stuff like that, and they have a high metabolic rate, and that's one of the things we talked about earlier on. And the thing about the higher metabolic rate is they're constantly changing over. They're constantly new cells are being produced, okay? And that's why we're getting rid of a lot of these. We talked about how sometimes in when we talk about X-ray exposure, what happens is that the tissues that are more commonly injured by X-ray exposure are tissues that have a high metabolic rate. There's a rapid turnover, and because their metabolic rate is fast to start out with, but it's making it even faster. So when we talk about like the inside lining of the gut, okay, and stuff like that, there's a high metabolic rate in these tissues, which makes them sometimes more prone to radiation injuries and stuff like that. But we'll talk about that down the road as well. So what are the functions that we find of epithelial tissue? Well, there's a lot of different things that epithelial tissues do. Number one, the first one's protection. If we look at our skin, okay, if you take your hand, just take your hand now and wipe it across the table in front of you or something like that, and look at your hands really close. Your hands are loaded with bacteria and all the kinds of garbage and gunk all over the place. Why don't those bacteria usually bother us? Because the skin is a protective barrier, okay? And that protective barrier prevents the bacteria from usually getting in. When we talk about how people get wounds, why do those wounds get infected? Well, because they've broken that protective barrier, and now that bacteria could fill the wound, and as a result could disseminate and to go other places. When they talk about burns, one of the things about burns, they come into what are called thickness, first degree burns, second degree burns, third degree burns, and stuff like that. And the higher the degree is, the deeper the burn goes. Like first degree burns, like a sunburn. So it only involves the outer layers, and yet those eventually will die and slough off, and you regenerate it after you got that sunburn. On the other hand, when you start to see blisters are actually second degree, where they actually start to cause a separation between the outer layer, which is called the epidermis, and the lower layer below that, which is called the dermis, okay? And that fills with that blister fluid that's inside there, okay? But what happens is in some more significant burns, like a very complex second degree and third degree burns, where it's all the way through the epidermis, through the layer below that, which would be the dermis, through the subcutaneous tissue, and possibly down to muscle. The problem is there's no protection. These people have a significantly increased risk of developing infection because they've lost that first protective barrier, which is that epithelial tissue. Okay. We also know that epithelial tissues provide some sensory reception, okay? Embedded within the skin, within linings and walls of things where the epithelial tissues are, will be various nerve endings. These nerve endings will detect stretch, will detect pressure, will detect temperature, and stuff like that. So the epithelial tissue is usually where the nerve endings are. They'll provide some type of a sensory function. Secretion, okay? If you look at the skin will be secreting like oils to keep the outside the skin lubricated and pliable, which is also somewhat protective. But other things could be secreted, through the skin as well. But largely things like oils and stuff like that. Lubrication again goes very closely to secretion. Okay, excretion is similar, but what happens is sometimes we lose other elements and stuff like that through the surface of the skin as well. Okay, when you sweat. Sweat has a lot of salt, has a lot of sodium in it, and I mean you're not gonna sweat, you're not gonna lick it and stuff like that. But I think if you did, I don't know why, okay, but if you did, it'd be sort of salty. People with cystic fibrosis, I think I talked about cystic fibrosis in some other video somewhere, and basically, oh, we talked about the location. How do we describe where a gene location is on a chromosome? If you remember back at that, what happens in cystic fibrosis? There's a problem in regards to how they handle sodium, and as a result, one of the tests that they used to do for cystic fibrosis is basically they would do a sweat test. They'd sweat them and then measure the amount of sodium that was in the amount of sweat that was there, and as a result, that would be, they'd be able to determine if someone had a higher level, which it puts them in the range for cystic fibrosis. Digestion, we don't digest too much through our skin. However, things can actually be taken through the skin through some type of a vehicle. Okay, but digestion is also aided in the epithelial tissue simply because when we talk about things such as calcium absorption in the gut, one of the things that helps with calcium absorption in the gut is vitamin D, and the vitamin D goes from very inactive forms or precursors to inactive forms to become activated, and one of those things that's really required is sun exposure. Ultraviolet light will cause the vitamin D to become active, so now we increase absorption of calcium in the gut, we decrease secretion of calcium from the urine and stuff like that, and we start to put calcium in the blood as well as in the bone if I have too much calcium. Absorption, things could again like be absorbed through the skin. Years ago there used to be something called DMSO. In fact, they still have DMSO out there. What happened was an industrial solvent, industrial cleaner, and what they found was that people, when they had DMSO, which was dimethyl sulfoxide, okay, and what happened is they would notice if it was over a joint, if they got this industrial solvent around the joints, if they had like arthritis, it was making them feel better. What was going on here? And it turns out that that vehicle actually took certain things in with it inside and absorbed things in through the skin that actually were better. How the problem was, it took everything else. It took dirt, bacteria, all kinds of other stuff, and people were getting infections and all kinds of crazy stuff. So a lot of people were selling DMSO as an industrial solvent, which actually the FDA never really said, hey, that was a good thing. It wasn't a good thing. I remember you used to drive down through the southern states and you see these big signs on the side of the road saying DMSO for sale here, and people would stop. One thing about DMSO too that was sort of interesting, a little fun fact that you could tell your friends and neighbors, is when people used to take DMSO, you knew they were taking DMSO because they either that or they were having a lot of Italian food, because their breath always smelled like garlic, very garlicky breath, and a garlic taste that they had in the mouth all the time. So transportation and reproduction, are just things that we have in all cells. So that's nothing new. Reproduction, again, because that high turnover rate. Okay. Now, when we look at cell shape, epithelial cell shape, okay, there are a couple different things we should talk about here. First shape we have is what's called squamous. The word squamous, when it shows up, means flat or scale-like. Okay, flat or scale-like. When I look at my my superficial layers of skin, on my epidermis, these are squamous cells. They're very flat. If you were to take a scraping on the inside of your cheek and put it underneath on a slide and put it under the microscope, you see all these layers, a layer of these flat-looking cells. And I'll show you what a squamous cell looks like in a little bit. You can't mistake it after that. Okay, but squamous means flat or scale-like. Cuboidal, guess what cuboidal means? Of course, it means like a cube. In other words, it's about as high as it is wide. It looks like a little square. Okay, and I'll show you some cuboidal cells. Columnar is like a cuboidal cell that grew up. Okay, it got taller. So in other words, it's wide, but it's also tall. We'll find columnar cells. Cuboidal cells we'll find like in the ducts of glands. As they leave out, they'll be surrounded by cuboidal cells. Columnar cells we frequently find like lining the inside of the intestine and stuff like that. And they may or not be what we call ciliated. Ciliated means that they sometimes have little fine hairs at the end of, we talked about cilia earlier on. They sometimes have little fine hairs at the very end of these columnar cells, which could trap debris and stuff like that when we breathe it in. We'll talk about that later in the year when we talk about the respiratory system, as well as other places. The fallopian tubes. The cells that line the fallopian tubes are columnar cells, but they're ciliated, so they can actually take an ovum and actually like body surf that ovum down the road. and get them to the uterus, okay? And transitional cells, okay? Transitional cells are cells that don't look squamous, they don't look cuboidal, they don't look columnar, but they're columnar, but they're basically in transition, okay? They're something that's changing a little bit. So they look a little bit different. They look a little bit atypical. The bladder has transitional cells. They're able to stretch and stuff like that, okay? So these are some cell shapes that we talked about. If we talk about cell layers, okay? Cell layers, this is a little bit different. But this is not that difficult. One layer is we call simple. If it's a one cell layer deep, it's called simple. So in other words, if I have squamous cells, they're in one cell layer thick, one cell layer deep, they're called simple squamous. Piece of cake. If something's stratified, it means two or more cells deep. Okay, when we look at the other areas, we'll find layer upon layer upon layer upon layer upon layer of a cell. So it'll be stratified squamous, or sometimes we'll find cuboidal cells. You know, two cuboidal cells, one packed on top of the other, because it is in layers. It's called stratified cuboidal cells. Okay, so simple means one cell layer thick, okay, or deep, and stratified means two or more cell layers deep. And I'll show you examples of both of those. We also have something called pseudostratified, okay, and we see this a lot in columnar cells. Columnar cells we see a lot with the pseudostratified. And what the pseudostratified means that it looks like there's multiple layers, but there's only one layer. Okay, it's one cell layer, and the reason why is in most columnar things we'll find the nuclei that line up parallel or line up in a line like a string. However, in the pseudostratified, sometimes because of glandular structures that are between the columnar cells, the cells, instead of being a perfect column, they might be a little bit angled a little bit, they might be a little narrow at the bottom, a little wider at the top, and therefore the nucleus might be up here, and the one next to it is a little wider at the bottom, a little narrower on the top, and the nucleus is down here. So you have the nuclei that go in multiple different layers, so it looks like it's layered, but it's not. It's simple, it's one single layer, but the nuclei are not lined up, they're all over the place, and that's called pseudostratified, and I'll show you examples of all of those, okay, as to how they show, okay. Now this is just looking at what we talk about squamous cells. Squamous cells, if you look at the cell, it's a little flat looking cell, you know, if you look at it, you know, it's relatively simple, you know, a little flat looking cell. Here's that little flat looking cell right here, okay. Here's a nucleus sitting right inside there. All this in here is going to be the cytoplasm. And there's just all these little cells like that all over the place, okay? And basically, it sits on a basement membrane. We talked about how what happens is, you know, it sits on a basement membrane, which is a small little membrane, or where it's attached to at the bottom. That's called the basement membrane. And that's what a squamous cell looks like, okay? But that's from a book. Let's look at, this is also a photomicrograph showing squamous cells. If you look, see, they look flat, look like a bunch of them just sort of paved together. You know, it's basically one layer of cells thick, and here's a cell, you know, right here. Here's one, it's next to one here, which is next to one here, you know, and they all look very flat. The same thing over here. Here's the nucleus we see inside the cell right there. They're a little difference in shape, depends upon how they fit with each other, okay? But that's basically what we call a simple squamous. Simple, why is it simple? Because it's one layer thick, one layer thick. And simple, and why is it squamous? Because these cells are flat. Okay, so that's simple squamous. Okay, that's pretty simple. Again, if you look at the inside of the mouth and stuff like that, you're gonna find lots of squamous cells. Okay, cuboidal cells. Cuboidal cells look like a bunch of little you know, slider buns there or something like that. What happens is what happens if I look at them, it creates a cube. You know, they have a little cube. It's like that. I'm trying to draw with my cursor, with my mouse here. Little cube like that, and that's what we see. This is like the lumen of a duct. You see right here, it's the lumen of a duct, and that's inside a duct. And you see these, the lumen is usually surrounded by just a single layer of these cuboidal cells. Okay, and that's what a cuboidal cell would look like. That would be a duct that's inside the pancreas, and that's the pancreas right there. So that's a duct you'd see inside the pancreas. And there you can see a little cuboidal cell. If you look at its height, it's about the same as its width. Cuboid looks like a cube, so it's cuboidal cells. Now this is a photomicrograph showing more cuboidal cells. Again, here's the duct, the opening of the duct in the middle. Here's the opening of a duct in the middle. Okay, and you can see these cells, and these cells are basically little cuboidal cells that are like that, you know. And let me just draw them with my pen as compared to my mouse. You can see them right there, cuboidal cells. Here's more cuboidal cells like here. You know, little cubes all over. And basically that's what we say. And they're simple cuboidal. Why is it simple? Because it's one cell layer thick. Why is it cuboidal? Because it looks like a cube. Piece of cake. I mean, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure that one out. So simple cuboidal. Okay, here's columnar cells. Okay, and this is what we see down here. Columnar cells, you can read all where they're at, the locations and stuff like that. You know, the upper respiratory tract, we'll talk about this later on this in the semester when we get to the respiratory tract. But you see these cells here are very tall, and they're narrow. So if we look down here, you see here's a tall cell and very narrow, and basically that's what we see with these columnar cells. It may have cilia. If you look here, there's cilia at the surface. See, that looked like a little brushy area on the end. That's a cilia, those small little hairs. And usually those hairs have a little wave-like motion to them we'll talk about later on. And again, where I mentioned before, one's in the fallopian tubes, also in the upper respiratory tract and stuff like that, we'll find these columnar cells. If I look at a photomicrograph, that's what we see here. This is perfect over here. This is absolutely gorgeous, okay? You see how what happens, here's the basement membrane down in here. Here's the cells. You can see how it's high. It's only a very, certain distance wide. And look at those nuclei, how those nuclei are sort of like in a straight line, and even over here, the nuclei are sort of lined up each other. You can actually see at the surface over here, you can actually see the cilia. You can see the cilia out of the surface right there. They don't have to be ciliated, but a lot of times they are, okay? But you can see the cilia on the outside and stuff like that. So that, that sort of is helpful to be able to see what's going on, okay? But that's a typical simple columnar. Simple, why? One cell layer thick, one, okay? And columnar because it's high and narrow. Looks like a column, piece of cake. Okay, transitional cells. And again, transitional cells, they're variable in shape. There are all kinds of really strange cells. They might look in different, they might come in certain layers where what happens is the cells don't look the same. If I look up here, the cells here look different from the cells here, but they're all from the same origin. Again, the common place we find transitional cells is in the bladder. These cells have a tendency to stretch a lot. Also in the urethra, or the tube that leaves, and the ureters. The ureters, the tube that goes from the kidneys to the bladder, and the urethra, the tube that goes from the bladder to the outside. We'll find these transitional cells in there as well. Okay. And these are transitional cells. This is a typical photomicrograph. And you just look at the cells, there's really not that much order to them. And you see here's a cell here, and that looks a little bit different from there. They're not quite as flat and as sort of as oblique looking as we saw with the squamous cells. And but they're sort of like a transitional. They're sort of cuboidal. They have sort of like a little bit of a cuboidal appearance, maybe a little squamous appearance. Some of them are a little bit taller, might look a little bit like a columnar cell, but they're none of any of those. They're sort of like a combination, and they're just sort of like, hey, I don't know what I want to be. I want to be whatever I want to be. Whatever it happens is I feel like today is what I'll be, and that's what these transitional cells are sort of like. Okay. Now again, when we talk about layers, simple means one layer thick. And that's what we see in this diagram right here. That's a simple cell. Simple cuboidal, one layer thick. Again, we go back to that same picture I showed before in regards to the little slider buns all in a row and stuff like that, or White Castle when they take all those little tiny little, like $half shaped burgers and And here's my simple columnar cells. Simple columnar, just one layer. Stratified means multiple layers. Okay, this over here is a picture of the skin. Okay, and basically these are the outer layers. These are the deeper layers. Actually, 5 different layers. We'll talk about that in a video PowerPoint in regards to the skin. Okay, the integumentary system. What happens is different layers, multiple layers. Because it has multiple layers, guess what? It's stratified. Stratified squamous. Okay, let's get rid of that. Okay, here's stratified cuboidal. You see also here's a duct that we talked about before. Here's a duct in here as well, but instead of having one layer of cuboidal cells, now you can actually see a couple layers. Here's a layer here, here's a layer here. So we have a couple layers. So more than one layer, it means it's stratified. Okay, and this is a stratified columnar. Some of it's higher, some of it's lower, some of it you can see higher and some lower and stuff like that. More than layer, stratified. Okay, and this is just looking at skin. We'll actually spend a lot more time looking at skin. And this right here, okay, let me just do it in a different color here. Let's look at it so I can see it. This down here would be called the dermis. Okay. This would be the dermis. It has a lot of blood vessels and all kinds of other, and nerve endings and stuff like that are in the dermis. What happens is that dermis ends right here. And this area right here would be called the basement membrane. When you actually have a cut, sometimes what happens if you look inside the cut, there'll be sort of like a shiny whitish membrane that's inside there, and that's the basement membrane. And everything from this point out, okay, is basically layers of my epidermis. Okay, starts out with one deeper layer and gets, and as they go from deep to the outside, they go through transitions. The cells start to change in appearance. Okay, and finally out here, they just get sloughed off. They just leave when they get out here because they're basically dying. You gotta remember the blood supply in the skin is going to be back in this area. Okay, so to be able to get nutrients out here, the further away it gets from that basement membrane, the less nutrients it's going to get, so therefore it's eventually going to die. The cells become thinner, they start to change, they keratinize, they become dead and flat and crumbly, and you can see the same thing here. So here would be my basement membrane, would be somewhere right in here. Okay. That's the basement membrane. So all this would be epidermis. This would be dermis down in here. Okay. And basically, again, blood vessels are in here, but not up here in the epidermis. So that's what we see. It's called stratified squamous. The cells basically have a flat appearance, but they're layered one on top of another, 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 top of another. They're in strata. Strata means layers. Strata. Stratosphere, layers. It's the layer like the atmosphere. You know. Here's stratified cuboidal. So you actually see in here, here's one layer. Well, let me do it in a different color so you can actually see it. Here's one layer here. Here's a second layer right there. Same thing here. Here's one layer. Here's a second layer. Okay, so basically they're cuboidal cells, but they're in more than one layer, so it's called stratified cuboidal. You should be able to recognize that relatively simple. If I was to show you a picture of that, like on a lab practical. It's a hint, okay, down the road. Maybe not this one, but you'll see something like that down the road. This is stratified columnar, okay? So basically what happens is have columnar cells one on top of the other, and that's what we see with that. You know, if you look here, here's one columnar cell, here's another columnar cell on top, and basically because it's in layers, it's called stratified, okay? So that's called stratified columnar. And pseudostratified. Pseudostratified, pseudo means false. Pseudo, P-S-E-U-D-O, means false. Okay, and it looks stratified. So if you looked at that layer down here, here's my basement membrane right here. Here's the columnar. It looks like there's multiple layers because there's a nucleus, there's nucleus up in here, nucleus. They're all in different layers. However, what happens is because the way the cells are, some of them are higher than the other, and as a result, the nuclei don't line up. And this is a picture, actually a true photomicrograph of pseudostratified columnar. You can see the cell. These cells are very high cells. Here's a nucleus here, here's a nucleus here, nucleus, 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 nucleus. They're all in different layers. And the problem is it's just because they're not perfect columns and stuff like that. You can see it better here. This one gets a little pinched over here like that, you know. This one might be a little wider there. This one's pinched. So as a result, what happens is we see the different shapes and the nuclei don't line up anymore. They're in different layers, but we do still have only one layer between the outer portion and the inner portion below where it sits on the basement membrane down in there. So that's called pseudostratified. Looks like it has multiple layers because the nuclei don't line up. They're all over the place. But the fact of the matter is they are still one layer of columnar cells, but because of the shape, because they're not all symmetrical, the shape will allow the nuclei to not line up. And if you look at the surface here, you can actually see the cilia. Here's cilia here, cilia. Okay, and there's also some cilia that you see over there. So that's what you'd see with the cilia. Okay, a couple things about epithelial tissue to get this wound down a little bit. First of all, glandular epithelium. We talked about how epithelial tissue is involved with a lot of glands. Okay, and what happens is what a gland is. Okay, is a gland makes some type of secretion, but it eliminates it through a duct. Okay, and so what happens is glandular epithelium is sort of adapted for that secretion. It could be either one cell thick or it could be two cell thick, like we've seen some of the cuboidal cells and stuff like that. And that's different from endocrine. So what happens is if I look at there are actually two different type of glands. One type of gland is called an endocrine gland, and I've been talking about the exocrine gland. Exocrine gland are ducts. They have ducts. Okay, and these ducts are basically that will have the, like we showed in the pictures before. We have other types of glands. They're called endocrine glands. Okay, endo. Now exo means outside. like exoskeleton, the skeleton on the outside of a bug. Endo means within, inside. And so what happens is endocrine glands have been modified from a typical type of an exocrine gland, because what happens is endocrine glands still make some type of a secretion, and the secretions that they make are called hormones. It should be hormones, okay? I can't write, but they're called hormones. And the way we get the hormones out of the gland is not through a duct, so no duct here, okay? But actually, endocrine glands are very bloody, okay? There's a really good blood supply to endocrine glands. So what the endocrine gland does is it makes these substances, hormones, puts them in the blood. And then the blood leaves and stimulates the hormones throughout the body, okay? And that's the difference. And that's how we've actually changed in the body some things from being exocrine, which are glands with ducts. Okay, we'll find these like in the pancreas. The pancreas makes a number of enzymes that secretes into the small intestine. But then we have a number of, and also the parotid gland. The parotid gland's right here. When people have mumps, the parod's the gland that gets inflamed. We'll talk a little bit more about the parotid later on down the semester when we get to the GI system. But it secretes out saliva as well as an enzyme called amylase into the mouth, so we can start to digest starches in the mouth. And if you look up, if you pull your cheek back and look up opposite your upper second molar on the top, okay, you might see a little bump on your cheek, on the inside lining of your cheek, and that's where the duct of the parotid gland actually empties into the mouth, okay? And so that's what's called an exocrine gland. So that would be an exocrine gland. Exocrine glands have ducts. Endocrine glands, no ducts. No ducts, okay? And they make their secretions, which are called hormones, and put those hormones into the bloodstream, and the bloodstream disseminates it around, okay? Now, where the pancreas, like I mentioned, had made certain enzymes and puts it into the small intestine, into a place called the duodenum, okay, which is the first portion of the small intestine, puts the enzymes into the duodenum, which is basically exocrine. It also is endocrine because the pancreas also makes a hormone called insulin, and insulin then gets in the blood, goes to the cells, and we talked about this when we talked about transport across membranes. The insulin then, as it disseminates throughout the body, through the bloodstream, hits receptors on the surface of cells, and when it hits the receptor, it binds with receptors on the surface of the cells that allow gates to allow the glucose to be taken inside the cell to be used for energy, okay? And those would be called endocrine glands. So not all glands have ducts. Exocrine glands do, endocrine glands do not. Okay, and that's just a picture, just so whatever the case may be, endocrine versus exocrine. Okay, summary. So what have we talked about today? We've talked about epithelial tissues. What are epithelial tissues? Well, we know there's a number of different functions, but epithelial tissues are coverings and linings, whether it be a membrane that covers the inside of the abdomen, inside the chest cavity, and over the lungs, over all the intestinal organs or in the abdominal organs, or the skin, or lining ducts that from exocrine glands and stuff like that. But they're coverings or linings. Epithelial means covering or lining. And basically, only a couple things you have to know. Squamous. Squamous means flat. Cuboidal means cube shape. Columnar means columnar shape. Okay. Transitional means, I don't know, whatever it wants, or this, different shapes and stuff like that. So that's transitional. And we know it comes in layers. Simple means that one layer. Stratified means multiple layers. Pseudostratified means it looks like it's multiple layers, but it's only one layer thick. Okay, so that's a little bit about epithelial tissues. And I'll if you have any questions about this, obviously we'll be able to answer any questions that you have about epithelial tissues. But again, we have a number of places in the body that do have epithelial tissues, and we'll be talking about those for the rest of the semester. I think you should be able to look at those photomicrographs and be able to pick out each of those different types of cells. I think that's very fair game in regards to seeing what you know down the road. Seeing we're not in a lab with a microscope, at least you have some very good representative pictures that show you what those cells would look like. Okay, so anyway, I'll see you next time. Next time we'll be talking about connective tissues, and then we'll talk after that. We'll talk about muscle, and then we'll talk about nerve tissues, which are the basic 4 tissue types. Anyway, for the meantime, be safe, be healthy, and we'll talk to you.